This chapter focuses on chapters 8 and 9. What about us? We have Dart's findings, which was Dart, who was a beginning archaeologist who wanted to start a museum with fossils and didn't know he would have them handed to him literally. He was given a fossil that would connect Darwin's theory that our species had originated in Africa because our closest relatives, gorillas and chimpanzees, are located in that area. The fossil that Dart found was the Australopithecus africanus, and that's the southern ape man, which he then put fully together and found it to be the Tongass child. Regardless, many of the populations didn't agree that we evolved and are relatives to the chimps and gorillas, hence the monkey trial where Scope was convicted for teaching evolution. Here we discuss Du Bois, Lucy, and the molecular data versus structure. Eugene Du Bois was able to find a fossil that was fairly similar to the one of a human, just a bit smaller, but overall pretty close, but hid it as he would have faced scrutiny during that time. Lucy was a big finding in the sense that it showed evolution and gave us a reasonable fossil record. Even though we see similarities among structure, it is more accurate to see the DNA sequence as it shows a relationship among the species. Here we have the splitting of species called hominin. So the categories of what species is related to, it relates to what varies along with what it's closely related to humans. We seem to be the ones that diverge furthest or seen as the more rare species between chimpanzees and apes or gorillas. Scientists then termed the hominin as the human side of our family tree once it split from the branch that became the modern chimps. Here we see the bone structure is similar with one of what could be seen as the earliest human ancestor, known as the Sahelanthropus. It could be a side branch that happened to go extinct in its lineage, but the structure is fairly similar. It could also be evidence that suggests that bipedal walking was one of the first evolutionary innovations. Here we come back to Lucy and the half ape, half human, and other new innovations. The femur and pelvic structure showed a good transition from what was the ape-like posture to that of a human posture. We have evidence here that posture/bipedal walking evolved before the brain. Lucy was a perfect example of a transition, as the waist up she had ape-like characteristics and the waist down she had human-like features. Another great trait that portrayed evolution well was the ability to use tools. The first tool using human was believed to be the Homo habilis. It used new tools for chopping and butchering.
Another important hominid was the Homo erectus. Its brain size of erectus was nearly equal to that of a modern human, and their skeletons were also nearly identical to ours, though they still had flattened, chinless face. Their tools were complex, and evidence shows that they're responsible for one of the most momentous events in human histories. They learned how to control fire. They were a highly successful species, not only in population size, but in longevity. It was around for 1.5 million years and disappeared from the fossil records 300,000 years ago. But what happened to the Homo erectus, even though they were considered one of the most successful species to ever walk on Earth? There's two theories. The first is called the multi-regional theory, which proposes that they evolved into Homo sapiens independently in several areas, perhaps because natural selection was acting in the same way all over Asia, Europe, and Africa. The second theory is called out of Africa theory, which proposes that modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa and spread, physically replacing Homo erectus, and perhaps by outcompeting them for food or killing them. But what propelled the evolution of humans? Many biologists believe that changes in climate and environment had something to do with the first significant humanian trait to evolve, bipedality. Traveling on two legs allowed humans to travel more efficiently from one path to another. But studies have recently shown that knuckle walking and walking on two legs show that these forms of locomotions don't use significantly different amount of energy. Another advantage of walking erect can be that it freed the hands to gather and carry food. But what happened to the human brain? Why did it evolve? Well, our hands were freed by the evolution of two-legged walking. Humans were able to fashion tools, leading to selection for bigger brains that allowed us to envision and fashion more complex and complicated tools. This theory has the advantage that the first tool appeared around the time that brains started getting larger, but ignores other selective pressures for bigger and more complex brains, including the development of language and negotiating. In 1975, Alan Wilson and Mary King at the University of California looked at the protein sequences taken from humans and chimps, and they surprisingly found out that they differed on an average by about 1%. They speculated that perhaps change in just a very few genes produced the striking evolutionary difference between humans and chimps. So, humans and chimps are almost the same, right? Wrong. Recent work shows that our genetic resemblance to our revolutionary cousins is not as quite as we thought. The 1.5% difference between ourselves and chimps is really larger than it looks. For instance, a 1.5 difference in protein sequences means that when we line up the same protein of humans and chimps, on an average, we'll see a difference at just out of every 100 human amino acid. But proteins are typically composed of several hundred amino acids. So 1.5% difference in protein 300 amino acids long translates into about 4 differences in the total protein sequences.
Example of more recent evolution within the human genome is provided by evidence for strong natural selection on the gene that controls lactase production. Among populations with a long history of cattle herding and milk consumption, the ability to metabolize lactose is maintained into adulthood. There are clear examples that natural selection has recently acted upon our species after the origin of agriculture and domestication of animals, and independently among different populations. Environmental pressure on humans is, has, and will always play a major role in selection and the evolution of humans. The future environment humans will face is difficult to predict, but disease caused by pathogens will continue to be a big player in human evolution. For example, malaria has been a constant struggle for humans. With about 500 million people infected worldwide, it has led to the evolution of disease resistance using half a dozen genes. This provides a strong positive selection in populations that deal significantly with the disease. Natural selection also keeps the frequencies of alleles that cause genetic disease at a low equilibrium frequency, such that new disease alleles are created by mutation at the same rate they are eliminated by selection. The equilibrium frequency is partly determined by how much it harms fitness, the more severe fitness effects being kept at lower frequencies. Thus, one might argue that we are interfering with this function of selection by treating people with genetic diseases and increasing their prevalence in the future. The impact of human actions on selection poses some moral questions that are outside the scope of science. Although science can certainly help people understand the consequences of their decisions, I think most people would make a moral choice to treat the suffering, even if we are aware that it changes the selection regime and may require greater innovation and improved treatments in the future. It might be a utopian dream to live in a world free of disease, hunger, and death, but as long as some people leave more offspring than others for any reason that's influenced by genetics, there will be human evolution.